Well, for some insight, we can bring in Amy Eaglestone, a visiting lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands, who specializes in Eastern Europe and in particular Georgia and Moldova. Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Just first, how would you summarize what's at stake in this election?
So I think really what's at stake is Moldovans' democracy, but also their European future, and potentially also European Union credibility and security.
And
There's
in what way? Sorry, go ahead.
So I think Moldova's European democratic future is really dependent on having a pro-European government, and this election is about choosing either a pro-European or a pro-Russian path. They have one big pro-European party, the PAS, that's in government currently, and a smaller pro-European opposition group running in the parliament. But their polling at the moment isn't that great, so there's a likelihood that they together won't even be able to create a majority coalition after the elections. And if that happens, the pro-Russian parties or pro-Russian bloc may see an opening to take over power. And in that case, they're not interested in pursuing democracy or closer ties with Europe. They're much more interested in shifting towards Russia and increasing those ties.
And European countries are watching this vote very closely. Can you explain why Moldova is so important?
So Moldova's at the moment, it's acting as a buffer for us. There's physical security issue. Obviously, Russia is waging a war in Ukraine. If a pro-Russian government comes to power in Moldova, Russia could potentially shift its military resources and open a Western front even in Ukraine. But it also can increase its cyber attacks, for instance, in the rest of Europe. It's currently focusing its resources on Moldova and to impact political processes there. But we could see that shift if the Moldovan government is already friendly to Moscow. We could also see an influx of pro-European Moldovans into the rest of Europe while they still can move. And what it's also going to create is more liberal voices within Europe that contradict European liberal values.
Moldovan authorities, we saw in that report, have been warning of Russian interference in this election, as well as last year's presidential election and EU membership referendums. Can you talk a bit more about that interference and what sort of form it takes?
So Russia has long been involved in Moldova ever since its independence in the early 90s. But what we've seen recently is this growth in hybrid warfare. And that means, on the one hand, security threats, but also creating crises for the government, like the energy crisis that they had last year. But what they're doing is primarily looking at spreading disinformation, and they're exploiting the concerns that Moldovan citizens already have about poverty, about corruption, about European liberal values, for instance. And they're doing that through corrupt practices. So they're paying people to post on social media. They're buying votes. They're using NGOs, financing organizations and political parties to spread information that's just untrue.
And do we get a sense that disinformation and that interference from Russia has been effective?
I think it's increasingly effective. Last year in the polls, presidential election, referendum on European integration, we saw that the polls were affected. The presidential election and both the referendum both barely passed. And we're seeing that in the last few months, Russia's really increased its activities. So there's a real danger that they will sway these elections.
Some opposition parties were excluded from these elections. Has that tarnished at all the image of the ruling pro-EU party?
So, funnily enough, yes. I don't think the ruling pro-EU party really has a reason to act anti-democratically. Its goal is to join Europe, and that means it has to increase levels of democracy and the quality of democratic institutions. But the narrative around banning these parties has been about banning opposition. and about influencing the outcomes. So in that sense, yes, some people believe that they are then undertaking these types of activities to influence the vote.
Moldova also has a pro-Russian breakaway region, Transnistria. Do people there vote in this election as well?
Everybody's allowed to vote, but in Transnistria, of course, that is a government and an authority that is that recognizes its own independence, and they are heavily dependent on Russia. So they consume Russian media, they rely on Russian economic ties, so the influence there is even greater, perhaps, than the rest of the Moldovan proper.
We've also seen EU leaders sort of trying to keep Moldova in their orbit. The leaders of France, Germany, and Poland all visited for the anniversary of Moldova's independence last month. How is that perceived in the country? Is that sort of seen as its own kind of pressure?
I think, well, the thing is, it depends on how it is interpreted. A subsection of the country that's pro-European, that believes in a European future, sees that as Europe saying, we want you in our group, we want you with us. And that's perceived as something positive. But there's also a subsection of society that believes that the country should have closer ties with Europe, with Russia, sorry, and they see this type of activity as pressure. Europe flexing its muscles.
And is that push-pull between Europe and Russia kind of really the main issue on the minds of voters in Moldova, or are there other issues that are sort of more important to people in day-to-day life that we haven't been talking about?
Oh, absolutely. So from the outside, we talk about pro-Russian, pro-European parties and votes and futures, but actually what people are most worried about is, their day-to-day lives, the improvements to levels of poverty, socioeconomic issues, education, healthcare, that kind of thing. And the past government made election promises a few years ago, especially focusing on improving or fighting poverty and fighting corruption, and they haven't really been able to meet those promises, and that has turned a lot of voters off from a past government. But because there's no other large pro-European party available in these elections, it's causing people to wonder who they should really vote for.
And do we have any sense of the likely outcome of this vote, or what are some of the possibilities?
I was going to say, don't make me say what's going to happen. So there are several possibilities, but the likelihood is that the PAS government is going to lose votes. It currently has a majority in parliament. It's probably going to gain about 25% of the vote. And that means that it will be forced to form a coalition. And that could be with another pro-European party, but that alternative pro-European party is still small in the polls, so it might not have enough votes to create a coalition government, in which case PAS is going to have to look at collaborating with pro-Russian parties, which obviously could quickly create a deadlock, policy deadlock. The other alternative is that the pro-Russian bloc of parties will win enough votes itself to form a government.
All right, well, we will be keeping a close eye, of course, on the results. Amy Eaglestone, thank you again so much for joining us today and giving us your insight. That's Amy Eaglestone, a visiting lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands, who specializes in Eastern Europe and in particular Georgia and Moldova.